and welcome. We have a very special guest today because he's been described by the BBC as India's Tolkien. Shekhar Kapur has called him a rock star author. Yes, you've guessed it right. We've got Amish Rathi with us, and he is, of course, a person well known for the Ramayana series, and even before that, the Shiva trilogy, which has had record sales, record-breaking sales rather. But today, he's with us to talk about his latest publication, which is The Legend of Suheldev, the King Who Saved India. That's a step away from mythology, isn't it, Amish? And what more can you tell us about this little piece of history that you have chosen to fictionalize? Why shift from mythology to history, and why choose to tell the story of King Suheldev?
Thank you so much for having me, Gautam. Absolute delight to be back on Doordarshan. In my mind, first of all, I've written even the Shiva trilogy and the Ramchandra series as historical stories. So the descriptions of what is the Indus-Saraswati civilization, Meluha, description of the Saraswati River, they're all historically accurate. So I write them as historical fiction in a way. So it's not fundamentally different in some ways from how Legend of Suheldev is. It's just that the Legend of Suheldev, the book, is far closer to us in terms of time. Now, why do I think the story is important? I discovered this story actually at a conference in Goa, where two friends of mine, both scholars, Abhinav Prakash and Sanjeev Sanyal, told me about this story. And I was inspired on listening to the story, and I was saddened in a way that such a consequential hero, a king who gave India 150 years of peace, who defeated one of the most brutal invading armies the world has ever seen, and most of us haven't heard of him at all, and that's shameful. And why is it so important to hear these stories, hear these messages? Because I think these stories carry, a message of unity, carry a message that when we Indians are united, we are undefeatable, right? And more often than not, when we've lost battles to invaders, we have lost because we have been divided. So others didn't need to defeat us; we defeated ourselves. So this message is particularly critical, I think, in today's day. I am a diplomat, so I obviously can't speak of the country that is trying to invade us, and we all know which country that is. And we Indians have to be united. I think that's a message of King Suheldev that echoes to us from 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, certainly. But, when one learned that you have written this book and one read about it further, of course, I wondered, why was it that I did not read it in school when I was reading history? What, to your mind, is the reason that, stories such as these were never even mentioned when we studied them in school?
I think two reasons. One, I think our establishment historians have had an excessive Delhi focus in our history books. And I'm not denying the importance of Delhi, but Delhi is not the only region in India. So you'll notice that the empires that have been covered in our history books were ones which were too big to be ignored. Like the Mauryas, the Guptas, they weren't centered around Delhi, but they were too big to be ignored. But any other empire which wasn't that massive and which wasn't centered in Delhi or had one of its heartlands in Delhi, you'll find was ignored. I mean, Rajendra Chola, for example, his empire was bigger than that of Akbar's. You wouldn't imagine that from your history books. The Marathas, for example, had a massive empire. Of course, Aurangzeb's empire was bigger. Aurangzeb at his peak had a bigger empire than the Marathas at their peak. But the Marathas at their peak had a bigger empire than Akbar even, and more than most of the Delhi sultans. And it's not just a Hindu-Muslim thing. The Adil Shahis in Maharashtra are completely ignored. Many of them were very liberal, good rulers, but they never conquered Delhi, so they were ignored. So this excessive Delhi focus, I think, is a lacuna in our history books, which needs to be addressed. Many parts of India have been ignored because of an excessive Delhi focus. That's one aspect. The second aspect, this is something scholar Sanjeev Sanyal wrote of, that the history that has been taught to us, and especially the history of the last 1,000 years, is more the history of our invaders than our own history.
Yes.
So we learn a lot more about foreigners who invaded us rather than those who put up a defense and a resistance. India is the only Bronze Age culture which is alive till today, the only pre-Bronze Age culture. China is not a pre-Bronze Age culture, it's relatively recent, it's only 2,500 years old. But all the pre-Bronze Age cultures, Egypt, Mesopotamia, they're all dead. They're museum pieces. India is still alive. Why are we alive? Because our ancestors were among the toughest buggers around. They kept fighting for 1,000 years. The image we have of the history that's been taught to us for 1,000 years is that we lost every battle and we're a bunch of cowards. That's what has been taught to us. Or a polite version of it would be that we are non-violent, or that we are non-violent and and sweet. Therefore, we got conquered. That is not it. The facts don't bear that out, because every other pre-Bronze Age culture which was attacked by the Europeans, Arabs, or Turks died out. Zoroastrian Persia, one of the greatest empires of its time, survived just 30 to 50 years. That's it. And they were, when the Arabs attacked, and they were wiped out. It's been 1,000 years. We are still standing, which means our ancestors were tough. They fought, and they fought hard to keep that which is precious alive, which is our culture. We should know these stories so that we are inspired by them and we see ourselves as a strong, tough culture. We are the only ones still alive, only ancient culture still alive.
And of course, you talked about how unity is a running strain through this 11th century story of King Suhaildev as well, which is of relevance in our present context as well. Being a diplomat, you said you won't name names. Neither will I, but we all know what you're talking about. And apart from the pointed about unity, what other things, as a diplomat, you think do we need to muster, and the lessons that King Suhaildev and his entire army and his loyalists really teach us in terms of handling situations such as the one that we find ourselves in? We have infiltrations, we have incursions, transgressions, and God knows what else.
I think besides unity, one of the key lessons from King Suhaildev is a line that goes back deep into our ancient past, into our ancient texts. The Sanskrit line, Shate Shatyam Samacharit. Dusht ke saath dushtata hi karni chahiye. And King Suhaildev had that approach that when I'm fighting with enemies who are honorable, I will be honorable. But when I'm fighting with enemies who are dishonorable, he was very clear. I will speak in a language they understand. So in a sense, perhaps a little closer to how Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj used to fight. Right? That when you're fighting an enemy who understands only a certain type of language, you will speak in that language. King Suhaildev, for example, one of the things that, not just in my books, one of the things that history teaches us, that when he defeated the Turks, he killed every single one of their soldiers, didn't leave one person alive. Now, you might call this ruthless, but the way King Suhaildev saw it was he was doing what was necessary to protect those innocent civilians who depend on him for protection. Right? Perhaps that is something to learn from heroes like King Suhaildev and Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj or Lachit Borphukan, from Assam, who were clear that when you are fighting an enemy which is dishonorable, and if you behave honorably, you will lose. So you have to do what you have to do. Lord Krishna's approach, in a way, as compared to, say, Lord Ram's approach, who would be Maryada Purushottam no matter what. Whereas Lord Krishna's approach was, I have to protect those who depend on me, which means if
no matter what,
I have to do what has to be done, right, to protect the innocents who depend on me. That was King Suhaildev's approach.
Now this comes from leadership. This comes from individuals. In the present context, are you suggesting that one should be looking for such individuals to lead the nation as well? Is it about a person? Is it about an idea? Is it about an ethos, belief? What should one really look for in terms of finding answers to the problems that we face at the moment?
I think it's a combination of all, because look, we are a democracy. We're not an authoritarian country. Our leadership reflects the will of the people throughout our history. Unlike in authoritarian countries where people may not have a choice, people themselves may be thinking something different, but an authoritarian ruler can just stamp his or her approach down. So it's a combination of it all. I think the approach that one finds of the nation, today, where we are in many ways much tougher, than we used to be. This reflects the will of the people, right? In a way, uh, and that is the nature of democracy. So my sense is, if you're someone who then wants to influence or make their own contribution to the course of events, the best thing to do is try and influence the people themselves, because ultimately, because we're a democracy, that will reflect in the way the country functions. It will reflect in the way the leadership functions, because we will end up selecting leaders or electing leaders who reflect the will of the people.
And democracy, of course, is a strength for India globally as well, because it is seen as a country that has people who have been given freedom to do what they want and pursue their best interest as well, with a collective will, of course, that has to be thrown in. But in terms of how things are shaping up in the world, especially in this COVID era, where a lot of deglobalization, anti-globalization is happening, what sort of a path do you think India is on right now, and how do you assess it?
Look, this is a time of intense change. There's no denying that. The COVID pandemic is certainly not the worst pandemic that humanity has faced. We faced far worse. Just the Spanish flu, for example, in the last century, just 100 years ago, killed 50 million people. 50 million people in a far smaller population. Global population would have been 2.5 billion at that point of time. Equivalent death rate of the Spanish flu in the world today would be around 150 million people. We are nowhere in that death range in COVID.
Yes.
And it's around 300,000 deaths, which is horrible, no doubt. But it's not the worst pandemic humanity has faced. But what is a black swan with this pandemic is not the death rate of the pandemic itself. It's our reaction to the pandemic. This is the first time in human history that the entire world has literally shut down. The first time. Right? So the economic impact of this is massive, and it will remain with us for years. An entire generation, perhaps two, will find it difficult to come out of this. This will have cultural, psychological impacts, right? And like in any, there are periods like this where the entire world, the board is just thrown up, all the pieces are thrown in the air, and no one is sure how things will land, right? Like the Justinian plague, which destroyed the Eastern Roman Empire and Zoroastrian Persia, weakened them, which made the conquest by the Arabs a lot easier, right? So could this be one of those black swan events which changes the world dramatically? Now, if you go through crises like this before, what are the countries that emerge stronger out of such crises? It's not necessarily always the wealthiest. Eastern Roman Empire is very wealthy. It's not necessarily the country which has the biggest army going into the crisis. It usually is the nation which is most gritty, which is most tough. Because what you need in a period like this is the ability to just keep your head down and fight your way through and emerge on the other side of this pandemic with as much strength as possible. So then you can play the game. A year later, 2 years later, your nation will have some strength. So it's about grit and unity that matters. And if you ask me, I have a sense, having traveled to many parts of the world, Indians, we are very gritty people. We are very tough people. It's almost impossible to expect the government of any country to have a completely well-organized reaction to this, because no one can predict what is going on.
Yes.
There was no war gaming for this kind of scenario, right? So all governments are trying their best, but it's a very difficult situation. It's the grittiness and the toughness of the people which will decide which nation emerges stronger. I think we Indians are amazingly gritty and tough people.
Mm-hmm. Is that how you're plowing on as well, as far as your writing and your own work is concerned? You're at the Nehru Center there. You're the flag bearer of Indian culture and tradition there, and perhaps the cultural capital of the world. So that's a huge, huge job to do. How are you managing?
Thank you. Luckily for me, I'm a workaholic, so I do very little else. So there are essentially, three big things keeping me busy. One is we moved all our Nehru Center events online. So Nehru Center is, it's a rich legacy. We've been here for many decades, and we have our own heritage property right here in Mayfair, in the heart of London. But I mean, we can't do any physical events now, right? So we moved all our events online, and actually, it's ended up being a blessing in disguise. We have an auditorium in our building. We could never imagine more than 150 people. That's the maximum capacity of our. Now we are doing online events, Facebook Lives. We are reaching out to 12,000, 15,000 people, and we are not just getting audiences from London. We are getting audiences from the Midlands, from Scotland, from Northern Ireland. So we are becoming a national brand. So
Great.
actually, it's a
Adversity to an opportunity.
Yeah, it is an opportunity the way I'm seeing it. So that is one huge aspect. We are pushing aggressively on that. Our social media has become a lot more active. And the second thing which keeps me sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just asking you, now things are opening up in the UK, in London as well. But in the lockdown phase, as far as the creative process is concerned, did it help or did it hinder it?
Fortunately for me, I very rarely have writing blocks, so I just keep writing. So it was good, that I had this free time and I kept writing. And the lockdown, which is where almost 20% of the fourth book of the Ramchandra series, tentatively titled War of Lanka, that's also been written, and Suhail Dev has been released. We are doing promotions for it, and the lockdown in London has not been as strict as it has been in India. So we were allowed to go out once a day. So I go out every evening for a jog to Hyde Park right next door. So you don't feel as alone. I'm living alone out here in this flat, but one doesn't feel as alone if you can go out and eat some friends in the park, take a jog.
Okay. So we now know that you're coming up with the next in the Ramayana series now, but I have a friend, a very big fan of yours, much bigger than me. He's read all your books. I haven't, sorry to say that. But he asked me to ask you this, that in the Oath of the Vayuputras, you had talked about the tale of the inherited war, which is the Mahabharata. So do you have any plans of retelling that epic?
Oh, yeah. Certainly. And that is a series that will certainly not be through the Writer's Center. That is something only I will write. And I might probably take that up after the Ramchandra series. Very excited by the Mahabharata series and the interpretation that one has. So I'm looking forward to getting down to that. But the Ramchandra series is a 5-book series, and only 3 books are out right now. So it'll take perhaps 2-3 years to finish that. Then the Mahabharata.
And the Writers' Center, the Important Writers' Center, is a big help there?
Yeah, certainly, because one of my biggest concerns in life is that Lord Shiva has blessed me with too many story ideas, and at the pace that I write, which is a book every year and a half to 2 years, I'll probably die before I finish all my stories. And that is a very disturbing thought for me, because I can't carry my stories into my cremation fire. As I've joked, meri atma bhatakti rahegi. So this Writer's Center, what it does is it allows me to kind of expand my capacity, right? So my core books only I will write. Shiva trilogy, Ramchandra series, Mahabharata series. But other stories which I do want to write, but are not core to Lord Ram, Lord Shiva, Lord Krishna, is that will get written through the Writer's Center. Where how it works is essentially we've hired 4 published writers. We are looking to hire more as well. I write the core story summary, which will be a 5,000 to 10,000 word summary, which then the Writer's Center, either a group or an individual, expands to 65,000 words, the first draft. And then I work on the second draft. So for you as a reader, it'll read as my book, but I expand my capacity. I can get more books out.
Okay, great. Now, in terms of people who don't read much, any plans of coming out with a version of the book on the larger screen? Larger screens are shut right now, in any case, in India. The smaller screen or the mobile phone and OTT platform, anything in the works there, in the pipeline there?
Well, that is certainly something I wanna work on. In fact, I've started my own company in Mumbai called Immortal Studios. And my elder brother Anish Tripathi, he's joined, he's running it. We've hired a fantastic guy called Aman Gurwada, who has 14, 15 years of TV experience. We've hired a team under there, and we are looking to develop, my books into, some into movies, some into a series. So we are working at it, and with Lord Shiva's blessings, hopefully we'll get that out soon.
Great, sounds great. And in terms of, if we go back to how things started off for you, in the last decade, really, you had rejections as well. And then it seemed that you just cracked the code as to what the, not just the Indian readership, but readership perhaps all around the world really needed from an Indian author. So if you wanted to make suggestions to others who want to find their own stories to tell, what would you tell them?
Very good question, Gautam. I think, my first book, you're right, it was Immortals of Melua, was rejected by every publisher it was sent to. And there were various reasons for it. They said that, look, the book is on a religious subject. The main readers are the youth. They aren't interested in this subject. Then someone else said that, I have these Gyan sessions in my books every 2-3 chapters because I want to discuss philosophies. And they said, look, if you want to appeal to the youth, you want to make it mass, you have to dumb it down. I was actually told that you have to dumb it down, which I realized is not true actually, because I went in and self-published my first book. And most, at my events, online events you'll see, or at LitFest, most of my readers are the youth. And most of the intelligent questions, the deeper philosophical questions, actually get asked by the youth. So this belief that you have to dumb things down to make it mass is not true at all. The same individual can like a suspension of disbelief, nonsense movie, and the same individual at this, at a different time can like something intellectual. I love a Salman Khan movie, for example. You can't accuse a Salman Khan movie of being high IQ. I mean, they never are, right? But you enjoy it. You put your brains aside and you go with the flow, and you anyone who loves Salman Khan and Bhai, you go with the flow and you enjoy it, right?
Now, Salman Khan might make a good King Suhaildev as well.
Yeah. But at the same time, one can enjoy, deep non-fiction books or even movies like Inception, which make you want to focus, right? So you can do both. So that's a thought I want to leave behind for readers. Don't assume that you have to dumb things down to appeal to the masses. Don't assume that. And be true to who you are, right? I mean, I'm a very proud Indian. That reflected in my books. Be true to who you are. And I think in today's day, people appreciate authenticity. If you're trying to be something that you're not, you get caught out in.
Yeah, because, after you succeeded. Yeah, you succeeded. A lot of people, tried to replicate what you were doing in one way or the other. But a lot of those works did not click. So perhaps people need to find their own stories to tell.
That's true. So my thing is that don't look at what's succeeding and then try and copy that. Like when my book Immortals of Melua was rejected, I was told, your storytelling style is good, but you picked the wrong subject. Write a campus romance novel, because that's what was succeeding. But that's not what I wanted to do. Not belittling campus romance novels, but that's not what I wanted to do. So the point one is trying to make is be true to who you are, be authentic. Some will like you, some will not like you. But don't pretend to be something else. You get caught out. It won't work.
Yeah, well, it certainly has worked for you, what you've been doing through these years. And some say that you shifted tracks, but at the same time, you're writing the Ramayana series as well. And you promised for my friend that you will take up Mahabharata as well. And it sounds great. All the more power to you. May you keep writing and entertaining us and, conveying certain very, very important pointers for the current day and age as well. Thanks a lot for joining us this evening, Amish.
Pleasure being here, Gautam. Thank you.